Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're really attempting a feat of spatial reasoning. We're tackling chapter 17 of Gray's Anatomy, all about the development of the head and neck.
Oh, it really is a feat. And it's a phenomenal area of study for one really fundamental reason.
Which is?
Well, unlike the trunk, with its neat repeating segments, the head and neck are built with a totally different set of blocks.
Hmm.
The whole instruction manual is unique. And everything relies on this perfect three-dimensional timing and migration of cells.
Right, and our mission here is to try and translate all that complexity, the layers, the timing, the way nerves and vessels relate in 3D into a picture you can actually see in your head.
Without a single diagram.
Exactly, painting the blueprint purely with sound.
And to do that, you have to start small. I mean, we have to go right down to the cellular level. When we talk about the head, the main building material, the mesenchyme, it's not from one place. It's a mix.
A multi-source construction site.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
You've got contributions from the neural crest, from placodes, and from mesoderm.
And that mesoderm part, that's kind of the first big red flag that the head is playing by different rules, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the trunk, you've got mesoderm from paraxial, intermediate, and lateral plates.
Yeah.
But in the head, it's just the paraxial mesoderm.
Only paraxial.
The source material is crystal clear on this. There is no lateral plate mesoderm contribution. So right away, your skeleton formation, muscle formation, it's all going to be fundamentally different up here.
So if the mesoderm is, let's say, the contractor, then the real architects of the face have to be those neural crest cells.
Without a doubt. What's so fascinating is that the evolution of the entire vertebrate head is, you could argue, directly tied to this new cell population. It's almost like a fourth germ layer. These cells pop off the neural tube and just migrate everywhere.
And they're responsible for almost all the bones and connective tissue in your face.
The entire face and the front of your skull, yes.
So how on earth do they know where to go? I mean, if they carry the whole destiny of our face with them, what tells them where to stop and what to become?
That's where the brain comes in. The developing hindbrain has these segments, these swellings called rhombomeres, and they set up the positional information. And it's all run by a set of master genes.
The HOX genes.
The HOX genes.
I always think of HOX genes as kind of the body's internal GPS system. You know, it tells a cell, you are here, so you need to become part of the jaw. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
They establish the coordinates, but, and this is the key piece for that very first pharyngeal arch, the one that forms the jaw.
The mandibular arch.
Yes. For its skeletal parts to form correctly, it requires the critical absence of HOX gene expression.
Wait, the absence of it.
The absence of it. If those neural crest cells heading for the first arch accidentally switch on their HOX genes, they get told they're in the wrong place and start forming structures that belong further down the body. It's like the most complex part is built by turning the GPS off.
That is counterintuitive. Okay, so that brings us from the genetics to the actual physical scaffold, the pharyngeal arches.
Right. We're talking 5 pairs that really matter in humans. The numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6.
What happened to 5?
Number 5 is vestigial. It shows up for a bit and then just disappears. So these arches, you can picture them as these big segments wrapping around the embryonic throat. On the outside, you have ectoderm, inside is endoderm, and the middle is just stuffed with that neural crest mesenchyme.
And each one is paired with a cranial nerve. That's the blueprint, right?
That is the immutable blueprint.
So let's start with arch 1, the mandibular arch. That feels like the big one.
It's huge. It's the foundation. Its cartilage is called Meckel's cartilage. Now, here's where a lot of people get tripped up.
The jawbone.
Exactly. Your actual jawbone, the mandible, does not form from Meckel's cartilage. It forms right next to it by intramembranous ossification.
So the cartilage is like a temporary scaffold that gets repurposed.
Precisely. It mostly disappears, but the top part of it gives us 2 of the tiny bones in your ear, the malleus and the incus.
Which is just incredible. 2 of the bones you hear with are evolutionary remnants of the ancient jaw.
And its function is clear from its muscles. You get the big muscles of mastication temporalis, masseter pterygoids, all powered by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve V.
Okay, next up, arch 2, the hyoid arch.
Arch 2 has Reichert's cartilage, and it gives us the 3rd little ear bone, the stapes. So between arch 1 and 2, you have your complete set. It also forms the styloid process and parts of the hyoid bone.
And a totally different function with a different nerve, the facial nerve.
That's right. The muscles here are the muscles of facial expression. They migrate all over your face, but they drag their nerve supply, the facial nerve, with them. That's why you can smile, frown. All of that is arch 2.
Arch 3 seems A lot simpler.
It really is. A
Oh,
bit of a breath of fresh air. It forms the rest of the hyoid bone. Its main muscle is the stylopharyngeus, and it's all innervated by one nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve number I. Simple as that.
and finally, arches 4 and 6, way down in the neck.
Right, these two basically team up to build your larynx, your voice box.
Mm-hmm.
They form the thyroid, cricoid, all those laryngeal cartilages. And they're both controlled by the vagus nerve, nerve X.
But different branches, which is clinically so important.
Very important. The superior laryngeal branch for arch 4 and the recurrent laryngeal for arch 6, which does all the intrinsic muscles. Surgeons have to be very, very careful with that recurrent laryngeal nerve.
Because that embryological path dictates the surgical anatomy. Okay, so we've done the external scaffold. Let's look inward now at the pharyngeal pouches.
Yeah, these are the endodermal pockets on the inside of the throat. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the things that form from these pouches, they go on these huge journeys, they migrate.
Let's track them. Pouch 1.
Pouch 1 goes out sideways and becomes the tubotympanic recess. If you follow it, you can see it forms the middle ear cavity, the eustachian tube, and even the inner lining of your eardrum.
Pouch 2 is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, pouch 2 is just the site for the palatine tonsil. The endoderm basically makes a home for lymphoid tissue to move into.
Okay, now for pouches 3 and 4, this is that classic anatomical paradox, right? They swap places.
They do. And if you can remember this, you'll never forget their derivatives. Pouch 3 gives rise to the inferior parathyroid glands and the thymus. And both of them descend way down into the neck and chest.
And pouch 4.
Pouch 4 forms the superior parathyroid glands and the ultimobranchial body.
So because the pouch 3 derivatives travel so far south, the pouch 4 derivatives actually end up on top of them in the adult neck.
Exactly. Migration completely overrides their starting position. And that ultimobranchial body, that's where we get the C cells of the thyroid, the ones that make calcitonin.
Speaking of the thyroid, its journey is a whole other story.
Oh, it's a classic midline descent. It starts incredibly high up, basically at the back of the tongue in a little pit called the foramen caecum.
And it travels down through the neck.
Right down the midline, along a path called the thyroglossal duct. And if that duct doesn't disappear completely, you can get cysts or even bits of thyroid tissue left anywhere along that path.
Which you see in the clinic all the time. Midline neck masses.
The embryology tells you exactly where to look.
All right, let's pivot to what we actually see when we look at someone. The development of the face, the palate, the mouth.
So this is all about 5 big swellings of mesenchyme. You have one on top, the front nasal process, and then paired maxillary and mandibular processes on the sides.
And the nose forms from placodes that sink in.
Right, they form pits and you get these medial and lateral nasal processes around them.
So the upper lip itself, what's that a fusion of?
The upper lip is formed by the fusion of the 2 big maxillary processes with the 2 medial nasal processes. And that fusion has to be perfect if it's not.
That's where a cleft lip comes from.
Exactly. Unilateral or bilateral, it's a failure of that specific fusion event.
Okay, now the secondary palate. I mean, for anyone trying to visualize this, it seems physically impossible. The space is so small. How do those shells form?
This is one of the most magnificent rapid maneuvers in all of embryology. So picture this. Initially, the palatal shells are growing vertically, straight down on either side of the tongue.
Because the tongue is in the way. It's just a big physical roadblock.
A complete roadblock. The whole process is on pause until the mandible grows a bit, the mouth gets bigger, and the tongue can finally drop down and get out of the way.
And once that happens,
The shelves, in an incredibly short period of time, just flip up. They rotate horizontally, meet in the midline, and zip themselves up. It's partly mechanical, but it's also driven by hydration of the tissue. Hyaluronin pulls in water and helps push them up.
and if that timing is off by just a little bit, if the tongue doesn't move in time, you get a cleft palate.
It's all down to that brief window.
Amazing. And the tongue itself is a mashup of different arches, which is why its nerve supply is so complex.
It is. The front 2/3 are from arch 1, so you get general sensation from the trigeminal nerve, but taste from a branch of the facial nerve. The back third is arch 3, supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve. The innervation tells you the whole origin story.
And the teeth, another complex interaction.
The classic example. Epithelium makes the enamel from cells called ameloblasts. The underlying mesenchyme from the neural crest makes the dentine from odontoblasts. They have a signal back and forth perfectly.
And get this, there's a physical record of your birth etched into your teeth.
The neonatal line. It's a real, visible line in the enamel and dentine that marks the metabolic stress of being born. Little piece of your history right there.
That is wild. Okay, final major structure, the skull. We divide it into the protective part, the neurocranium, and the face part, the viscerocranium.
And here's where those two tissues we started with come back in a big way. The neural crest builds the entire facial skeleton and the front part of the skull base.
And the rest.
The back part of the skull base, around the notochord, that's for the paraxial mesenchyme.
And we see both types of bone formation happening at the same
We
time.
do. The skull base forms from a cartilage template. That's endochondral ossification. But the flat bones on top of your head and in your face form directly from membranes. That's intramembranous ossification.
Now, this next bit is genuinely one of the most amazing facts. How the holes in the skull, the foramina, are formed. You'd think the bone forms and then a hole gets drilled.
But that's not what happens at all. The amazing thing is that the presence of a major nerve or a big artery actively inhibits the mesenchyme around it from turning into cartilage.
So the nerve itself is telling the bone not to form in that specific spot. It carves out its own pathway before the bone is even there.
It predetermines its own exit. It's an absolutely beautiful example of function dictating form at the most basic level.
And finally, when this goes wrong, craniosynostosis.
Right. The flat bones of the skull grow at their edges, at the sutures. If one of those sutures fuses shut too early, the skull can't expand in that direction.
It can't grow sideways, for example.
Exactly. So if the sagittal suture on top fuses early, the skull can't get wider. To compensate, the brain pushes it to grow longer and narrower. It's a spatial compensation, dictated entirely by which growth plate shuts down.
Wow. We've gone from, these tiny migrating cells all the way up to the entire skull, the jaw, the tongue, the glands. It's just an incredible story of coordination.
And it all comes down to timing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A slight failure in migration, you get a facial syndrome. A failure in descent, you get ectopic thyroid tissue. A failure of fusion by just a few hours.
Cleft lips and palates. These clinical connections are just powerful reminders of how a tiny delay in that embryological choreography can have huge, lifelong consequences.
We really are.
That complexity of timing brings up a final thought for me. We mentioned the palate can only fuse once the tongue descends, which depends on the fetal jaw growing. If that early anatomical constraint is so critical, how much does it influence things later? Postnatal functions like suckling, or even the years it takes to switch from an infant swallow to an adult one. Does that prenatal blueprint sort of set the mechanical habits we use long after birth?
That's a great point to reflect on. It reminds you that development doesn't stop at birth. It's a continuous process, and those earliest steps can define the rules of the game for years to come.
Indeed. Well, thank you for diving deep with us into the head and neck. We really hope the mental picture we painted helps clarify some of these intricate relationships for you. We'll see you next time.